Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name's Christina Kent, and I'm a fine artist based out of San Francisco. In this video, I want to give you some insights into how I study the work of other artists. Whenever I see an artist's work that really inspires me, I like to analyze it and think about what components of this work are really compelling and what could I potentially bring into my own work. And today, we're not going to be studying from a painter, but instead we're going to be looking at a favorite photographer of mine, Saul Leiter. So if you want to join me, get your paints, get your sketchbook, and let's get to it. And if you're not familiar with Saul Leiter's work, he's a photographer who's known for capturing New York City mostly in the 1940s to the 1960s. And I think that he has such an eye for composition. He's great at capturing the feeling of being in the city. But one of my favorite things about his work is his ability to create atmosphere in his photographs. And he does this a lot by taking photos through glass that has water on it or something else. Maybe it's dirty for whatever reason. He can't necessarily get a clear picture. And I love how that creates atmosphere in a lot of his photographs. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on with my study of his work today. How does he create atmosphere? And I'm going to be focusing on this photograph in particular. It's a pretty interesting scene. We have what looks like a man walking in the foreground with maybe a couple people slightly behind him, and then a few other people off in the distance. There's some cars and a building in the distance as well, and it looks like it's a snowy day, but we can't quite tell. Like, there's suggestions of buildings further in the distance, and of course we have the suggestions of people, but we can't quite see them. Even the figure who's closest to us seems to be almost dissolving away. And so I love how this image has some sharper edges, some softer edges, and just this really incredible mood. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on trying to capture with my study of this photograph today. For materials, I'll be using my Moleskine art sketchbook. I'll also be using some small brushes. These are flat brushes. They're cheap craft brushes I got from the art store, but they are synthetic flats and two sizes. And then I'm going to be using acrylic gouache paint. This is the acrylic gouache from Liquitex. I have white and blue. I have my Stay Wet palette to be able to mix the paints, and then I have a paper towel and some water. And I also have a pencil. So to start, I'm just going to use the pencil to sketch out some of the basic shapes that I'm seeing in the image, the basic dark shapes. So I have the shape of the man in the foreground, the people behind him, the shapes of the buildings, things like that, just to generally mark out where things are in the composition. After I have the basic shapes marked out, then I'm ready to start going in with the paint. So for this sketch, I'm going to be using white and blue, but you could use any light color and any dark color. The main thing we're going to be focusing on here is more about the contrast and the sort of edges, like trying to create that feeling of atmosphere. So any monochromatic palette would work well for this. So I start out with my darkest shapes first, and so I get my blue and mix a little bit of white into it to make it opaque. And I start filling in where I'm seeing the darkest darks. Once I've blocked in the darkest shapes, then I move into a slightly lighter value. So I mix a little bit more white into the blue, and I start painting the people behind the main figure, or the blurs. I'm assuming they're people, and some of the edges on some of the other darker shapes. This dark marks of, I guess, shadows in the snow in the background, and some of the buildings that we're seeing a bit further in the background. Next, I mix an even lighter value to continue going along the value scale, moving into the lighter and lighter shapes that I'm seeing. And as I put in these lighter shapes, I start to think more about the edges between the light shapes and the dark shapes. And I can use my finger here to start to blur some of those edges. Now, I'm using my finger because I'm working with acrylic gouache. If I was working in oils, I would not recommend doing this. But for this small sketch and for using acrylic gouache, I find that just using my finger quickly after putting the paint down is a nice way to blur and soften the edges in the painting. And as I'm getting into these lighter layers and blurring some of these edges, I'm just noticing how beautiful and soft the edges are in the photograph by Saul Leiter. The way that the man in the foreground is really just kind of dissolving on the left, also the building that we see kind of in the middle ground is dissolving into the background, and the cars as well, the way that their shapes are just so soft. It's really quite beautiful. And this is just a small, quick sketch that I'm doing, but I'm trying to keep that in mind as I'm putting in these shapes. I'm trying to keep in mind, where am I seeing these really soft edges, where are the edges a little bit sharper, a little bit harder, and I'm trying to capture that in my sketch. Often in my own work, I'm thinking a lot about the balance between soft edges and hard edges. And I think that one thing that really drew me to this image in particular is I think it has a beautiful balance of both. I also found this to be a really good exercise in simplifying shapes, especially in the case of the cars in the background. Like sometimes things like cars can be really hard to convey in a simple manner, but if you have sort of a grainy, out of focus photograph, it can actually make it easier to see those simple shapes. And I found that to be really true here. The cars in the photograph end up looking like just some very simple abstract shapes, and yet they still very clearly read as cars. Towards the end, I also lighten up the background a bit, giving you a sense of the building sort of dissolving into that snowy atmosphere. And with that, I'm ready to wrap it up. And so here's how the final sketch turned out, and of course it's not going to be the same as Saul Leiter's photograph, but I hope you can see we got a little bit of that same atmosphere in this sketch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this video, and if you have any questions, in the comments below. And as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for supporting this channel and making these videos happen. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.